and former National Security Advisor to President Trump and Vice President Pence, General Keith Kellogg. He's also a Fox News contributor. Morgan, General, great to see you. So we've gone through Secretary Blinken's opening statement. It's a lot of President Biden's hands were tied, but Donald Trump negotiated this. He had no other choice but to get out. And again, reiterating, nobody saw this catastrophic collapse of the Afghan government and military. Morgan, let's start off with you. What do you want to hear from Secretary Blinken today?
Well, I think a lot of people in the intelligence community would agree with, would disagree with those lines that you just read from Secretary Blinken's testimony. Listen, there's a lot of key things that should have happened at the State Department beginning in April when President Biden decided that he was going to fully withdraw all troops without any conditions. So you have things like it's been reported in the media by the Free Beacon that the crisis response unit at the State Department that is responsible for evacuating Americans in crisis situations, that was reporting directly to the undersecretary and to the secretary under Mike Pompeo. Under Blinken, that was moved back into the bureaucracy. So there was no single point of failure or responsibility when you have a crisis situation to get Americans out. This is in the weeds, John, but this is the kind of arcane questions that have to be answered that lead up to the type of disaster that we've seen. I'd also want to know, if I was a member of Congress, why have you still not named a counterterrorism coordinator at the State Department? That was an ambassador sales for us in the Trump administration, an incredibly important position, especially when we're looking at the potential reemergence of al-Qaeda and ISIS in Afghanistan. And finally, I'd want to know, why has there been no asylum agreements announced? All right, this is one of the main things that the State Department should have done before we left, before the military left, which if there was a situation on the ground where Afghans needed to be evacuated, we should have had third-party countries in place where it would have been safe for Afghans to seek asylum instead of trying these heroic feats to get over the border or to jump on charter airplanes, as we've tragically seen over the past month.
General Kellogg, I want to ask you, this is Jackie here. You know, we've heard so many times that this administration planned for every contingency, but there were so many examples that seemed like surprises. I mean, the communication methods that the State Department, for instance, used to reach out to what were supposed to be priority groups became instantly ubiquitous, according to source information we have from our reporters at Fox, to the point where people who were supposed to come to those gates couldn't get to the gates because everyone had the QR code or whatever it was that they were using to get out. And then also reports about this ISIS bomb being on shaky intelligence. What would you ask the secretary if you were in this hearing today?
Yeah, a great question, Jackie. Thanks for having me today. Look, I'd start the very first question, and it wouldn't necessarily be on the people that we've left behind, because I think there's a bigger question. I would ask him right at the start, why did you move away from the 29 February 2020 agreement that was made between the United States and the Taliban, signed by Mullah Baradar and Zal Khalilzad, which was conditions-based? And one of the conditions we had there was intra-Afghan talks between the Taliban and the Ghani government. If those agreements and those stipulations did not occur, then the agreement fell apart. And we had no obligation to leave on 1 May, 30 May, 1 September, or any other date that was in there if they didn't follow through. And the second question I would have asked Tony Blinken is, who was negotiating for us at the most senior levels? Who was talking to the Taliban? You know, President Trump on 2 occasions, because I was in the Oval when he did it, talked to the Taliban leadership, talked to Baradar, and made it very, very clear about the conditions for success going forward and the consequences if they didn't follow through on that. Did they talk to the Taliban leadership? What did they say to the Taliban? The third question I'd ask is, what kind of requirements did you put on Zal Khalilzad as a negotiator? What kind of agreements did we want to have made with the Taliban? And the last thing I'd ask is, when you went to NATO in June, what did you tell the alliance? What kind of agreement did you make with the alliance that we were going to move out, and were we going to talk to them before we left Afghanistan? Yeah. Those are hard questions to ask. And I think we need to have those answers, because we lost a war, a 20-year war. We lost it.
Now, one person who should have a pretty good sense of where this is going forward is somebody who was at one time the Secretary of Defense, prior to that the CIA director, and then was also chief of staff for the President of the United States, talking about Leon Panetta. Listen to what he said yesterday about the reconstitution of al-Qaeda and potential Taliban support for a reconstituted al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Let's play this here.
it's clear to me that they're going to continue to support al-Qaeda and allow al-Qaeda to basically continue to develop and expand. And I think they will plan additional attacks on our country as well as elsewhere.
So, Morgan, let's go back to you. I mean, that's a pretty dire warning for a person who's got an awful lot of expertise in international affairs and intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's important to note that ISIS just conducted a successful attack against American troops. We just saw them murdered in Afghanistan a few weeks ago. So clearly there is capabilities there. Listen, the situation is very applicable, as the general will know as well, to what President Trump had to deal with in Syria and Iraq whenever he took an office. And there was actually a physical caliphate of ISIS. And one thing that's important to note, when you hear people in the military and other leaders talking about these over-the-horizon capabilities. I've talked about this on your show before, John. Counterterrorism strikes, these drone strikes, these quote-unquote over-the-horizon strikes, that is not a counterterrorism strategy. And that's what we needed to hear from Secretary Blinken today, because ISIS will try to emerge, the al-Qaeda will try to get the Taliban to let them continue to have a safe haven in Afghanistan. These are all facts. And so if you take it back to the situation in Syria and Iraq, when ISIS emerged there, President Trump had a comprehensive strategy, including some special forces boots on the ground, to destroy the physical caliphate. And of course, we remain in Iraq and Syria today in an advise, train, and equip mission. So what we need to understand, it is possible to make sure that you keep the threat in check. You will never stamp out an ideology, right? Crazy people will always believe in al-Qaeda and ISIS, but you can destroy their physical caliphate that they tried to set up in Afghanistan, similar to what they set up in Syria and Iraq when President Trump took office.
General, one more question for you. Just my observation here. It seems that our reporters have been able to get pretty good answers from the Pentagon. We've had press conferences, we've had interviews. With respect to the State Department, we've been getting more information on background from a source with knowledge, and fewer instances where the leadership is getting out and saying the things that the Pentagon is giving access to in comparison. Do you see evidence of friction between the State Department and the Department of Defense in terms of how they their messaging is shining a light on whether there was any sort of conflict between them?
Yeah, well, there's always a little bit of friction there, Jackie. I mean, you always see that between the Defense Department and the State Department. Look, I saw that back in the early years of the Iraq War when you had, the friction between Donald Rumsfeld and the State Department as well under Colin Powell. But look, let me just go back a second. What's happened with a comment Leon Panetta made? It's a pretty interesting comment, because the agreement we had with the Taliban was they would not allow al-Qaeda into that country or any other organization out there. That was part of the agreement. But now when you look at what you see now, you look what's on the left side, when you look at a map, you've got Iran, you've got Afghanistan, you've got Pakistan. You talk about an ISIS caliphate, you've now got a huge amount of territory that is now controlled by basically, to me, a rogue state on the left with Iran, Afghanistan, and then supported by Pakistan that has nuclear weapons. I think we've got an enormous potential for a huge terrorist state in the Middle East that is bigger than we've ever seen before. So I think we have to be aware of that. But again, I want to close by saying, look, we had the original agreement, and the agreement with the Taliban was they would not allow al-Qaeda or ISIS-K or the Haqqani network or anybody to operate in that country once we signed an agreement. That agreement was not signed, so there shouldn't have been any agreement, or there shouldn't have been any need for leaving that country until an agreement was made. So, it's sort of like we are where we're at with, and I asked Tony Blinken those hard questions.
It looks like we're getting pretty close to this hearing starting.